I'm delighted to be here at tonight's Leicester Vichaar Manthan event. Vichaar Manthan is a phrase in Sanskrit to mean the churning of ideas or thoughts. VM is built around the idea that by earnestly exploring the toughest challenges facing current British society through varying viewpoints, each of us can churn out some deeper insight.
And I invite Divya Prabha to give us our opening remarks and the foundation for our discussion.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you all today. And I've been tasked with laying a foundation about Dharma with respect to technology. As you well know, the oldest living tradition, of course, is the Dharma. And I want to start with giving a very succinct definition of what Hindu means in Sanskrit, because with the Sanskrit studies I've done, I started off with superconductivity at university when I was very young, and now I'm working more with the subtle energies of Sanskrit, and those subtle energies have great impact whether you're talking about technology or life in general. So when we talk about a Hindu, one of my favorite definitions I found is hinsayaha duryate yasya hridayam iti sa Hindu, which means Hindu is that who by their heart, not this heart but this intellectual heart in the Brahma Chakra, is far from violence. That person is defined as a Hindu. The other thing that I think is really wonderful about this Sanskritian Dharma is the definition of Bharat. Bhayam rati iti bharatam, which means that thing which is joined by light is Bharat. And the Vedas itself defines that Bharat is there where Bharatiya Sanskriti is. And Bharatiya Sanskriti is that which is joined by light, which ultimately is knowledge itself. So these are the very foundations of this Dharma. And then another, when we talk about what actually Dharma means, there are a lot of people coming up with their own definitions due to their own individual modifications of the mind. But I think it's very important to go back to the roots, to understand what the ancients gave us, because they were in an enlightened level of being. And they gave us in Manusmriti, Driti, Kshama, Damaha, Asteyam, Shocham, Indriya Nigraha, Di Vidya Satyam Akrodo, Dashakam Dharma Lakshanam. It says that the 10 definitions of Dharma, according to Manu in the times of the Smritis, are Driti, meaning fortitude, Kshama, meaning forgiveness, Damaha, control of the mind, Asteyam, non-stealing, Shocham, purity and cleanliness, Indriya Nigraha, the control of the senses, Di, wisdom, Vidya, knowledge, Satyam, truth, Akrodo, absence of anger. These are defined as the 10 definitions of Dharma. And one more that we have is Akilo Vedo Akilo Dharma, that the roots of Dharma are in the Vedas, and the Vedas meaning knowledge. So the whole foundation of our ancient living tradition is based on knowledge, stable wisdom, control of the senses, truthfulness, non-stealing, cleanliness, and a stable intellect. So that is, a really wonderful platform to start with. So how did I come to pick up this Dharma? I think is useful to think about, because, as I said, I started off as an 18-year-old, very interested in superconductivity, inspired by that, going into business on the trading floor. But I had this sense of lack of completeness. So I was very inspired by the knowledge that I was gaining, very inspired by the people I was working, but there was still a sense of emptiness, that there wasn't quite enough. And that is what took me into meditation and Dharma. And it's not that I wasn't living an honest life, but the principles bringing into daily life and living by Dharma, living by Bharatiya Sanskriti, is where I got that sense of completeness, which I think is important when we come to talk about the future of technology, because we want to be able to maintain that sense of completeness and not to lose our sense of ourselves through it. It is said in philosophy, in Vedanta, that the mind is like a sharp knife. In the hands of a doctor, it can save a life, and in the hands of a thief, it will take a life. And technology is the same kind of thing. We also have individual responsibility to use it for a higher purpose, for the best purpose. And that is our responsibility as individuals, to use our viveka, our discrimination, to use it for the betterment not only of our limited individuality, but for the community and for the society as a whole. That is the way that I see that the Dharma is an important foundation for anybody involved in the business or the developing or the using of technology, that we each have individual responsibility to do the best with every single breath that we have that is better for everybody as an entirety, as the entire universe. With that, I will leave my remarks for later. Hari Om Tat Sat.
I'd like to invite David Wood up to give us his insight and a background into the development of technology in terms of the past, the present, and where we're going in the future.
As you heard, my name's David Wood. You can follow me on social media, Twitter, DW2. I was involved in many years in setting up some of the foundations of mobile computing and smartphones, where I saw how big an effect rapidly changing technology might have, effects which nobody really anticipated. And more recently, I have been, for the last 10 years, chairing London Futurists, where we've had lots of meetings looking at this question: shaping tomorrow's world. What are the factors that will improve tomorrow's world? What are the factors that might spoil tomorrow's world? And what can we as individuals do about it? The question is, will future technology be a help or a hindrance to individual and societal flourishing? My answer is, it's going to be a big help and it's going to be a big hindrance. And I'll try and explain that as I look forward to 2050. But as a futurist, I'm going to start by looking back, because I think we will get better foresight on basis of having better hindsight. And I want to look at some statistics from 1270, which is statistics that the Bank of England has gathered as to the average wealth, the average economic contribution of somebody in England over these 600, 700 years, 750 years. I wonder if you can imagine what kind of line this is. Is this a straight line, perhaps? Is this a cyclical line, up and down? Is it perhaps an exponential line? Let's look at the data. Indeed, it's sort of one slow exponential curve, and then from about 1800 it's gone up even faster. And you might wonder, well, that's just one country. Some futurists have tried and put data for the economic well-being of the whole world into one chart. So this goes back to 1000 BC, and it looks a bit like this, adjusted for inflation. And something interesting is happening round about here, 1800. And you may say, well, that's average, but far too many people are still poor, dreadfully poor, and that's correct. But you can look at the statistics for what proportion of the population is still living in absolute poverty. And for most of history, most people were living in extreme poverty. But more recently, we've changed that. And of course, there are still too many people living in poverty, but comparatively few people nowadays die of starvation. We have more people dying, in fact, of obesity rather than starvation. And again, this changeover in about 1800. We can look at other statistics such as, very important, how long could somebody expect to live? And for most of history, you were doing well if you lived 30 years. For most of history, If a woman had children, maybe she had 7 children and 5 of them would die before her. That was the state of nature, if you like. Since about 1800, that statistics have changed, and thankfully now, the average life expectancy for somebody born anywhere in the world is now over 70. And there are various other versions. We could look at how much energy an average person is using. That's shooting up as well, and that has consequences, of course, how much energy is being used in terms of the impact on the environment. We could look at the impact of war-making potential. If we put all of that on a single graph, along with various other historical factors, such as the fall of the Roman Empire, the Genghis Khan's expansion and killing maybe 9% of the world's population in the wake of things, actually the only thing that shows up on these economic metrics is the impact of the Industrial Revolution moving forwards. And if we sum all that up, and here I'm going to quote from an MIT professor, Andrew McAfee, who I think is very interesting. You can read some of his books, like The Second Machine Age, or more recently, Machine Platform Crowd. He says, history teaches us that nothing changes the world like technology. For thousands of years, of course there were kings and queens, and of course there were wars, but most of the economic statistics, the population statistics, social development hardly changed until, from about 1760 onwards, a whole bunch of technological innovations sparked off each other. James Watt found a way of making the steam engine more effective, and then goodness knows it changed the whole world dramatically. And I'll just quote this final comment from McAfee. Great wars and empires, despots and democrats, the insights of science and the revelations of religion, none of them transformed lives and civilizations as much as a few practical inventions. Now, some of you are probably getting a bit upset now. You're going to be saying there's more to life than economic well-being. And you're right. So I want to look next at some statistics that have been gathered to try and measure more fully human well-being. I've got here a couple of charts from the recent book by Steven Pinker. It's a big book. It's a thoughtful book. It's quite controversial, but I agree with about 90% of it. His book on Enlightenment Now. And he quotes at some length the analysis of a couple of academics. One of them you can see in the dark black there is an academic from Spain who looks at what he calls the historical index of human development, and he pulls together things like, yes, health as measured in terms of life expectancy, and also height, because on the whole, the taller people are, the healthier they are, but also access to information, education, literacy, and not just how much wealth somebody has, but what can they do with the wealth. And you plot all that, and you can see it's gone, broadly speaking, up, up, up. And another academic also quoted in this book is an academic from Holland. And he looks at the same kind of statistics, but mixes in things to do with the well-being of the environment, looks at the equality issues, gender equality, and income inequality, looks at statistics for civic engagement, how much of the population is engaged in civic factors, looks at things like violence. And that also, on the whole, as you can see, is up with a slowdowns occasionally. So I will summarize that. For the last 200 years, broadly speaking, humanity has been on an upward trajectory of, broadly speaking, improving human flourishing. So I finished looking backwards, and I'll spend the rest of my time looking forwards. And most people, if you ask them what they expect is going to happen between now and 2050, over the next 32 years, what scenarios would they have in mind? Most people who don't think about it so much will say it's probably going to be roughly the same. You know, we might accelerate a bit, things might improve a bit more than in the past, or they might slow down a bit. Some people have noticed that some of the statistics of well-being have actually gone into reverse recently, such as the average life expectancy for the last few years, in some cases, has actually gone down. Some people in middle age are dying more often than they used to. I'm here to say that all of these business as usual scenarios are, in my view, unlikely. I rate them collectively as only having about a 10% chance of happening. because I think we're about to see something similar to what happened in 1800 in terms of a seismic change in human capability. It's called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I don't have time to explain all of the background. I will have a few slides in a minute on the essence of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. But these forces that are being unleashed, similar to the forces of the First Industrial Revolution, are so big and pervasive, so potentially destructive, that if we're not careful, we might see a much more significant downturn in human well-being. And this is a scenario which some futurists call social collapse, environmental tragedy, humanitarian collapse. Because of these technologies which are harder than ever to control and ensure they're used well. I don't think that's the only possible outcome. The most interesting scenario is the one in which we are wiser, more thoughtful, and we take this tremendously powerful technologies and we use it to push human well-being up, more quickly than before, into a scenario that I call super abundance, sustainable superabundance. And by the way, that's for everybody. It's not just for a small part. I think that is the most likely scenario. If I look ahead, I think humans are, on the whole, good, even those who are often strange and quirky and eccentric and horrible. Actually, we can see inside them good tendencies too. On the whole, we humans are smart, thoughtful, resilient, resourceful. So that's the most likely outcome. But there's still far too big a probability, in my view, 30%, maybe a bit more than 30%, in which we will go sadly downwards. So the most interesting task of futurists is to try to consider how can we steer the evolution of humanity away from that social collapse scenario into the sustainable superabundance. And the first thing is to be aware of what the power of technology can do. If I look at three possible mistakes in anticipating the future, the first mistake is not to pay enough attention to the accelerating power of technology, to be naive about what this technology can do. It's driven by more people practicing science and understanding science and living in an open society than ever before, building on each other's solutions in positive feedback cycles. But the second mistake that people can make in anticipating the future is somehow imagining that technology determines the future by itself. It does not. The outcome of technology is very much dependent on human reaction, human feedback, measured by things like legislation. What rules do we put in place? Are we going to let Uber do whatever they like? Are we going to let Airbnb do whatever they like? What subsidies do we put in place? What skills do we train people so they're able to take good advantage of the technology rather than being victims of it? What services do we put in place? And very critically, what values do we bring to this? Which values are we going to use in deciding which of these technologies should be legislated for and which technologies should be legislated against? And you can see in here the roots of a third possible problem in mapping out the future, which is that if the values and the thinking are rooted to the technologies of a previous era, then what we ask for and what we do may not at all be well suited to the challenges of today's technology. And if our understanding of today's technology is naive, we're likely to come a cropper. I listened to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, saying, maybe blockchain can solve the problems of the Irish border. And I thought, my goodness, this is just the tip of the iceberg of the naivety of modern leaders in not understanding technology's real capabilities in that. So both these problems are magnified as the pace of technology increases. What's happening. My last few slides are about the Fourth Industrial Revolution. People talk about this a lot, although I don't think it's quite clear what it really includes. So I follow the lead of a few other futurists in calling the Fourth Industrial Revolution NBIC, where these four letters stand for nanotech, biotech, infotech, and cognotech. Four tremendously powerful revolutions in their own right, which gain their significance even more in terms of their interactions. Infotech is not just computing, that's the third industrial revolution. It's looking at data and drawing conclusions about the data via machine learning. So it's a boost to machine learning. Nanotech is manipulating atoms on a smaller scale than ever before. So it's not just 3D printers, it's whole swarms of 3D printers. It's computers that are so small that they'll fit inside the bloodstream. And this new kind of computer is called quantum computing. Biotech is when we reprogram not just the silicon in our smartphones, but reprogram the genetics in our own bodies. When we can modify our DNA, modify the epigenetics, modify our biomes, and lots of other things. And when we can also create new life. Cognotech is when we actually touch base with some of the things that the first speaker, Divya, was talking about. Understanding the mind more fully than before. And modern science is coming at the same problem in a very fascinating way too. And we have a greater understanding of what's going on inside the mind when people are meditating, when people are being intuitive, when people are being creative. And I think in the next couple of decades, we're going to boost forward as never before. There's 4 quadrants on here, because one side is physics and the other side is biology. The top is roughly hardware, the bottom is roughly software. But what's most important, and what we could spend a long time exploring, is the fascinating crossovers between all these things. The more we've got nanotechnology, the more we can build smaller sensors, the more we can understand what's happening inside somebody's brain without being invasive, the more we understand that, we can feed some of the insights back into AI. And it's no surprise that the biggest AI companies have all got lots of people in their groups who've got PhDs in neuroscience. So the next couple of decades are the story of new machines, including very small machines, new kinds of algorithms, not algorithms written by human software engineers, but algorithms written by algorithms. It's also the story of new kinds of life, and it's the story of new kinds of minds, artificial intelligence and hybrid minds. And we could look in more detail at what I call 20 ways in which the world's going to change in the next 20 years. Don't have time to go into all of this now. Each of them has the ability to challenge all our old ethical and values frameworks and cause us to rethink anew. And there's crossovers again, which I call planetary technology. But as I said earlier, the real outcome isn't dependent on the technology alone. The real outcome depends on what human values, what human systems we put there, sometimes called social tech. How do we distribute financial resources? There's fintech. How do we provide access to information? Sometimes called distributed ledger technology. All of these things, in my view, are going to determine whether the other more physical technologies and biological technologies will be for good or ill. And right at the heart of that, as you can see, education. I think the world will be determined, whether we're successful or not, by how good our education is, and right at the bottom is politics. If our politics continues to be as bad and as dysfunctional as it is now, it's going to increase the chance that we're going to end up in a social collapse rather than a sustainable superabundance. There's lots more to say, but let's leave that for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for a very balanced and succinct overview and introduction, I think, to this topic. We'll head over to Subhash.
Thank you very much, David, Divya. Set the scene up quite nicely. Ravi for the invitation and yourselves for an opportunity to share another perspective on much of what David has mentioned, but also a different perspective from where Divya had set the scene. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time, I guess, sharing with you my experience of having spent 12 years in India working with an investment bank, having come from a pretty comfortable middle-class academic background, but then been thrown into an environment that was pretty new to me, although obviously Indian origin, but still very much a new experience. That's helped me to take a look at the technology background that I come from and put a different slant on it. And what I'd like to do is to spend a little bit of time here to show how sociology and human capacity has where it's led us to, and perhaps pose a number of provocative questions for us to think about. I suspect I'll be offering more questions than answers, but hopefully that's food for thought. One way around. So, I also wonder, is it any wonder that in a hyper-connected, multitasking world of virtual reality and physical reality merging into one at such a pace that even faster than the merging of all the subplots in Bodyguard that seem to leave us frazzled and asking us questions of where is technology taking us? Is it actually better or worse? Is it going to help or is it going to be a hindrance? Is there any wonder that we may have a sense of anxiety around these questions and actually what can we do about it? Anything about it? Can we or can't we? Sitting here in comfortable Leicestershire, perhaps it's just all above us. I'm not so sure. I think there is things that we can do in my view. One thing that hasn't changed in the millennia before us and even through the remarkable changes of the last 250 years, one thing that hasn't changed is actually really human behavior. Human behavior really has driven us from well-being, physical security, emotional security, psychological well-being. That's really what drives it at the very core. How we drive it, how it manifests, obviously has changed. It varies a lot, but it hasn't really changed in a great deal of time. And what's actually interesting is that one thing that has changed, though, is the pace of technological change, and our, in a way, our capacity to keep pace, to absorb it, to differentiate, and to be able to pick and choose what we need or don't need. What we actually have done is over the millennia and the last 3 industrial revolutions, is that as we've raised our capacity to extend our reach, with the first industrial revolution to the third, our ability to go beyond our physical senses and extend ourselves to travel, to generate power beyond human and animal power, has allowed us to reach out and start to dominate our environment. Actually, not just dominate environment, but actually change our environment. Change the atmosphere, the biosphere, the lithosphere, our habitat, and actually start to not live within the controls of the environment, but change it fundamentally. That leaves us with a substantial human footprint. And the questions that I'd like to pose here is do we really understand the consequences of our technological prowess? Do we really appreciate the downstream consequences of our behavior? And what can we do about it? So to reinforce the message, one of the things that our pursuit of wealth and prowess technical prowess has led us to is an explosion in our population. So 7.4 billion. The projections are that by the next 100 years, it'll extend to well over 14 billion. Even though the growth rate has come down substantially, as you can see, to near zero, the population growth is going to continue. There are projections from the World Economic Forum that perhaps by 2050, that the planet's ability to sustain food and nutrition will be exceeded by the population. In other words, sustainability may be on the threshold. What can we do about it? So we have gotten wealthier. That's for sure. As a planet, it's uneven. We know that too. we may not feel particularly rich, but if you cast yourself back to 250 years ago, 300 years ago, when the agricultural revolution was just taken over, it became evident that the productivity may have increased, but so did redundancies, believe it or not, 300 years ago, where farmers needed to find a new way of earning a living. It's interesting that a number of, during that period, a number of conditions confluenced together for conditions to set itself such that these triggers led to the first industrial revolution, particularly in Great Britain. Why would that be? Certainly a number of discoveries, a combination of individuals, a combination of finance being available, and obviously the power generation that led to the snowballing effect that we now see ourselves here today. Yep, poverty may well be eliminated in our own lifetime. It seems to be well on the way. And you can see that it coincides, no surprisingly, with the technological revolution, the population growth, and indeed a desire to share knowledge and education that's helping eliminate poverty. Of course, as we progress, our aspirations change, our consumer mentality will keep moving the goalpost further out as materialism continues to drive capitalism predominantly in our planet. Literacy, well, again, communication, the collection and dissemination of all that we know has made it easier to share that wealth of knowledge. Will literacy be eliminated? I think it is. That's certainly an aspiration for everyone that precedes us and continues to. As we said, the wealth distribution, though, has been pretty uneven. Certainly in the last 35 years, China has led the way in eradicating poverty in its own population and elsewhere. China and India not far behind it. Although still very uneven, the sheer masses of wealth that's been generated there is yet to peak, for sure. However, debt has also quadrupled, actually probably more so than that. $250 trillion worth of debt amassed predominantly in the last 150 years. That $250 trillion today represents about 3.2 times the wealth of the planet. Let's sink that in. So there's 3 times more debt than there is wealth on a planet. If that was your own household financial planning, how would you feel about that? The majority of that debt, not surprisingly, is concentrated in 3 countries: US, Japan, and China. And perhaps there's a bubble there to be bursting fairly soon, or not. We shall see. Well, in addition to the debt burgeoning, so as obesity, we've gotten fatter, quite simply, as we satisfy ourselves with our consumer society. So what about the footprint? Our human footprint, we know the planet has actually gotten warmer. The World Meteorological Organization estimates that we are already 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial era temperatures. Of course, the Paris Accord is aspiring to keep that below 1.5 degrees. Certainly there's greater aspirations to push ahead with that. I guess time and politics will show as to whether that is really achievable. One thing is clear, that policies and programs to transition to a low carbon society is still only taken off. A long way to go, in my opinion. But what hasn't changed is the energy consumption, still predominantly driven by fossil fuels, as you can see from there. Nuclear and renewable energy is less than 5% of today's energy consumption. It's still predominated by the fossil fuels. Now, solar power has been, and wind has certainly made progress, but yet it's only 300 gigawatts of installed solar power capacity on the planet. It's still a drop in the ocean to our current consumption, let alone taking into consideration what's in demand over the next 100 years. What's going to change? Well, one of the things that we can turn back to and learn from China is that over the last 25 years, China policy had installed solar panel production to such an extent that allowed them to invest well over $400 billion over 25 years in specifically bringing down its energy intensity, the amount of energy it's using in recognition of its own growth. Maybe there's a lesson to be learned here. Well, so let's have a look at another example of our human footprint. Some of you may be aware of one of the worst ecological disasters on the planet in recent times. This is a picture of the Aral Sea in Central Asia, borders Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. In 1989, it was the fourth largest inland lake, 600,000 square miles of sea, disappeared in 25 years. In 25 years, that much water disappeared, changed the microclimate in that area. Why? Cotton farmers in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan drew away more water than you can imagine than is required to sustain that lake. And the consequence of that is that the pesticides being used in the area fed back into the lake. The concentration rose, salinity rose. As a result of the pesticides, further dried out. The topsoil became airborne. The pollution became airborne, led to a significant increase in respiratory diseases in the community in that area. One thing led to another. And as the microclimate changed, a runaway process further drove down to what you see here. Now, the good news is there was action taken to build dams and start to revive the flow of water back in again. The irrigation that was installed has now been improved. The lake is now starting to come back again, and fish and livestock is now starting to return back to the sea. Still a long way to go. Again, I think there's at least two lessons for us to think about here. Is, again, understanding the consequence of the actions that we take, but also taking preemptive and reactive actions can still reverse some of the footprint impact that we have left so far. Perhaps if there are, let's say, examples closer to home where pollution has fed into and starts to feed into the human food chain, perhaps we'll take a greater focus on the downstream impact of our human footprint of pollution and how that feeds back into our own lifestyle. Thank you. Wow. In which case we'll have to move on a little bit quicker. So plastic waste still continues to burden our footprint. Let's have a look at some of the future tech. So is it going to be a help or a hindrance? As I mentioned before, human behavior tends to be a lot to do with extending and controlling our environment and our reach, an extent to which we've are able to influence control of our environment, and in fact, even to recreate environments. One thing that has actually changed is the pace of the innovation, and that's quickened. So the life cycle to innovate and to put products out into the marketplace is just shortened. One example that we have here, and it was mentioned earlier, was around immersive technologies. You may have heard about augmented reality, virtual reality, and merged reality. These are technologies that have the potential to be able to recreate the perception of our environment in a digital world in such a way that you could control objects to interact with digital objects in a way that has some interesting practical examples. The style of education can change. Our classroom way of disseminating knowledge could fundamentally change to a more experiential one by recreating environment, let alone trying to travel. Perhaps the need to travel will be eliminated. As was mentioned earlier, the sheer compute power that we have amassed so far is still going to be nothing in comparison to future technologies that are coming up. Quantum computing and neuromorphic computing will allow us to add at least 1 billion times more of compute power that already exists today. And as that compute power, machine computing capability reaches and exceeds human capacity to compute, that's when singularity is considered to be met. And this is where human and machine intelligence start to merge. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, we start to get into a world of what sounds like, Star Trek. Many of you may have seen the Borg. Today we already have, in a way, methods to enhance our physical capabilities with ear implants and dentures to contact lenses. But what about extending our physical ability with an exoskeleton? Or what about the ability to be able to 3D print using synthetic biomaterial organs that can be implanted into our body? Thank you. I will wrap up. We'll skip through that one as well. You've already heard about AI and drones and the development of sentient beings to the point where artificial intelligence may well be a species of its own right, both legally, logistically, morally, mechanically. We in the next 100 years, I would say, and perhaps even before then, have the ability to generate artificial intelligence to that level. To wrap up, if I may, we already know Blade Runner. Today we may start debate as to whether enhanced physical abilities, people with enhanced physical abilities will be treated differently. What I would say, though, in conclusion, though, is while we know about the physical resources of energy and the environment and the knowledge that we've amassed, we've focused so much so on the economics and the efficient use of those resources. But ethical leadership is probably an area that I would advocate as an area that requires a step change too, for us to be able to steer those technological changes and as to determine whether future technology is a help or a hindrance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Provided an insight into some of possibly the darker sides of technological advance. I think I'll pick up on that. So David, you mentioned societal collapse. Now it's fairly clear from your speeches that obesity is increasing, tech addiction is increasing. So to some extent, we're not catching up mentally in the maturity required or keeping up with the pace of technology. So what would result in a societal collapse? And if so, what would that look like?
There is not just one scenario ahead in which we have a societal collapse. There's quite a few. There is the possibilities of extreme weather, which we're already seeing. It's not just something for the future in which we will have possibly a runaway climate change. We're already seeing that. And that magnifies all the other problems. It means that parts of the world are seeing lots of climate refugees, people who want to move with greater pace and greater alacrity to elsewhere. That puts on more pressure onto governments all over the place. And then it's a question is, are our governments going to respond just to populist and short-term and sensationalist possible approaches, or are we going to be able to have a deep, thoughtful discussion about them? And there are risks of a greater tribalism than ever before. We have tribal instincts in our human nature, possibly in ancient bygone days, in prehistoric times when we were on the African savannah. A fear of strangers made good evolutionary sense, and tribalism made good evolutionary sense, the same as a sweet tooth in those long ago days made good sense. But now, in our present time, if we have adverse problems of climate change, if we have nations going to war with each other, not just with military weapons, but also with cyber attacks, with social media attacks, we end up getting angrier and more divided, and that bad aspect of our human nature comes to the fore, then all bets are off, and we could end up really going into a new dark age.
Thank you. So what is it that we need to do to develop the mental maturity required?
I don't know how many people know, but Harvard has recently produced a report about the Sanskrit effect, showing that there is increased grey matter in the brain after Sanskrit memorization of the Sanskrit mantras. I think that it's very clear that, because you talked about the ethical morality, going forward with the leadership, we all have equal responsibility to self-develop ourselves, to be in a position, one, to use it, or whether we are in one of the people that is involved with the development, or whether we're in the leadership. Bringing Dharma, bringing into our practical daily life, but not just as a rule and ritual basis, but developing our intellect, developing our mind, expanding our consciousness from inside, connecting to the soul is I can only see this as the only way forward to self-regulate technology, because human nature, by its very nature, is individualistic. It is separated unless we get to that expanded state of consciousness, and that is, I think, the best protection that we can have. I know it sounds a little bit fluffy and a little bit out there, but
let's expand. So where is that going to come from? I mean, I think in the UK we spend an average of just over 8 hours a day looking at a screen. Is the screen going to teach us? Where is this going to come from? Is it an app that's going to? Are the answers still going to come from technology?
Answers can come through technology. I mean, if you even turn on Facebook, or open an app, you can find Mindspace, you can find Headspace, you can find mindfulness lectures, you can find lectures on YouTube of yogis, you can follow a meditation class, a yoga class, listen to mantras, listen to a lecture on philosophy. There's so many positive things out there, but it comes down to the individual's discrimination to choose to use it. Because, like a hungry dog can, when it's hungry, it needs food and it takes food immediately. But when its stomach is full, it won't take food, even though it might be very nice food put in front of it, it will just sniff it and walk away. But a human being, if they're very, very hungry, and then slightly substandard food is placed in front of them, they'll think about, well, in an hour fresh food will be made that I might like more, so I will choose to wait a little bit longer, even though I haven't eaten for 12 hours. And on the converse side, they have a full stomach, and auntie's made some great ladus, and say, have one, and you say, no, my stomach's full. No, have one. Okay, I'll have one. And that is the power of discrimination, to override nature and to do according to your will. And so it is our discrimination that can use the technology in the right way and access these positive things that are out there, as well as negative things. So again, that comes down to our individual determination to do something that's good for ourselves.
Okay, so technology can provide the answers, but we have to have the demand and will to develop it. So are startups, is there a demand for this? Are startups looking into, well, actually people are asking us to develop these apps or these technologies that help them focus or become more mentally mature?
Well, before I attempt to answer that question, I would agree with you, Dina, that whether technology is the master or whether technology is the slave, the utility value of various technologies is, I think, it's the differentiating factor. If there is a lack of discipline in terms of how much time you spend on Facebook or Googling, or in search of information, can make a big difference as to whether you're wasting your time or actually you really are getting maximum value of the ability of the internet to be able to provide you with knowledge and information. There is an insatiable desire to, as an individual, perhaps consciously or subconsciously, to better themselves. How are you bettering yourselves? At what price? Often the challenge is when that ability to differentiate is lost. And in my view, I think that's where it's let's call it social leadership. The fabric of our families and societies can help us to remind ourselves and differentiate when a technology becomes the master and not the slave. Back to your question though. Are startups recognizing this? From my experience, the phenomenal entrepreneurs that I've come across almost invariably are driven by a need to fill a gap. From their own perspective, whether it's driven by a particular discovery or a perspective of a gap or of a need. And those ones tend to be more successful, obviously. As to whether there is any, well, I certainly haven't seen any real desire to be able to say, this technology, society doesn't need this type of technology. I haven't seen that. It's driven by a desire to progress, for wealth, to fulfilling a particular gap that's perceived. Having said that, social startups, social ventures, and others are often deeply driven by a deeper motivation.
Let's pick on that. So then, is it fair? I'm going to address this one to David. Is it fair to say the individual should take responsibility. When we were having a conversation about Facebook earlier on, I mean, these companies spend millions, if not billions, and huge amounts of manpower making sure we're addicted, making sure we stay on our phones. Is it fair to leave that responsibility on the individual and say, well, you have to develop the maturity to deal with this hugely addictive technology that we've spent billions developing?
I think we need to help each other here. We need to be able to occasionally find ways to intervene with our friends and family in the right way to help our friends and family be the better people that they could be. And if it's done right, then we'll feel good about it when we're on the receiving end of such advice. Because the power of this technology is incredible. We're spending lots of money paying the cleverest people on the planet to find ways to make us stay online longer. And of course, it's found out that we'll tend to stay online longer if we get more emotionally upset, we get more emotionally riled. And so naturally, the effect of being online is to push us into these more powerful emotional states when actually we often do things that our better selves would wish that we didn't do. So I think we should, of course, we have our own individual responsibility, but we should look after each other. And I think we can develop apps that in some ways do help each other. I'll just give one example that grew out of Google. One of the first employees in Google, one of the earliest employees, had a background in Buddhism, as I understand. He developed a course inside Google called Search Inside Yourself, in which he taught people the practices of mindfulness, meditation, but without using lots of, be careful what I say here, without using too many Sanskrit words, but more engineering concepts that the engineers already knew about debugging and tracing and monitoring processes. So he taught people in these the same concepts, but by using terminology that they were more familiar with. He took advantage of advice from people like John Kabat-Zinn, I think I've got his name right, as one of the leading authorities of various kinds of meditation. And this course is very popular in Buddhism. Say that again. This course is very popular in Google and has now been spun out into a separate organization called Search Inside Yourself Leadership Initiative, SIYLI. And they're there. I don't think they're there to make money particularly. Their mission there is to teach people mindfulness and fulfillment, and as a side effect to bring world peace, as they say, with a smile on their faces. I think there's something in that. I think there are more applications that could help to be like guardian angels. Already when we type sometimes, the word processor will underline something we've typed wrongly. It'll say you've misspelt that or you're using bad grammar. Increasingly it's going to say, consider saying it like this instead in a way that's going to be more friendly. And occasionally it's also going to say, actually, what you've just written, you think is correct, but it's well known to be false. You're passing on fake news. Don't do it. And in the way that sometimes when we click on a link just now, our mail software will say, actually, beware of this link. It's deceitful. It's not from whom you think it is. Increasingly, our guardian angel software, which might live inside our smart glasses, increasingly it might even speak inside our ears when we've got these earbuds on, or it might just vibrate in a way similar to a friend might tap your shoulder or kick you under the table in exactly the right way that husbands and wives can kick each other after all these years, which basically says, think a little bit more carefully here. So I think the software may do that and help us to be true to our better selves.
Thank you. I'd like you to come in on that. David's fairly optimistic that actually, given the right impulse and right individuals behind, we can develop technology that helps us and is positive. Conversely, is there a need for us to unplug completely at all?
Of course, that it comes down to individual levels. But when technology is used in the right way, because technology initially takes you outside, but when it takes you outside to take you back inside, then it's a positive thing. Because ultimately, that sense of completeness, every human being wants to be happy. There's no human being on this earth, I think, pretty much who seeks to be sad and to be uncomfortable and unhappy. Everybody ultimately wants to be happy, and very often in modern history, happiness has been equated with wealth development. But, as we're seeing increasingly in the modern times, people are realizing that there's an aspect of themselves missing. That's why we're seeing like this development of this Zen app and the mindfulness movement, meditation and yoga movements. So I think that, you know, if you have got the right people developing the technology, and that is, again, dependent on themselves. So again, back to their individual responsibility, you know, and you know, when you are involved in meditation or having clarity of intellect, the level of inspiration is much more expanded than a closed down individual can imagine or be inspired to produce. So one would hope with increased expansiveness in society and in clarity of not just mind but of intellect, because you know, the intellect is beyond the mind. So if you have got that clarity developed through Dharma, mindfulness, etc., then you have got a good foundation to ensure that technology is produced in the right direction that is beneficial to everyone. And as the first point I said was technology taking you outside to go inside, making life easier to use what breath you have for the betterment of you as an individual, society as a whole, is, you know, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it seems you've given a sort of two-part answer. One is that there's a motivating factor for tech companies to develop this, which is wealth creation, and there's a motivation from the individual, which is towards happiness and a sort of sense of completeness.
Well, the developers also have the motivation, it's a financial motivation, right?
Yes.
You know, because seeing again is that form of happiness coming through to them. But if they have that level of internal development, of that unity within themselves, that clarity, and to enable them to inspire things for greater good, greater benefit. And, you know, with that internal expansiveness, automatically it takes into account, because it sees further, it intuits further away, so it can see the consequences of what they're doing in a greater light, because it has that light inside when there's that clarity of intellect.
Okay, let's pick up on this, because we were having a discussion about social enterprise, and in some ways them being more aware and more driven towards this positive goal. Why is that? Is that coming from a sense of greater awareness?
I think in part, yes. Social ventures, the good, successful and sustainable social ventures are the ones that are still steeped in a drive to generate wealth. What it does do, though, is perhaps the successful ones is change the time horizon expectation on which to generate some kind of financial return versus some other kind of non-financial benefit, i.e. an upliftment in financial inclusion, for example, or educating a number of children who otherwise would not have access to education. From my experience, is that those, let's call it, greater motivations are incredibly important and vital. And I've had the good fortune of meeting a few and investing in some that allow to reinforce that greater good. Now, I think it's important to differentiate between, let's say, charitable giving and sustainable, financially viable ventures. Big distinction. An Uber, for example, is still an example, I think, of having generated substantial good. Controversial, for sure. Debatable in many ways, for sure. Unintended consequences of such a disruptive model, for sure. In my mind, that comes back to the question of whether material wealth and capital gains is or should be the driving force over societal gains, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, I think we've touched upon a really important topic. I mean, David's exponential graph of GDP per person, possibly making it look like once we're as wealthy as we need to be and satisfied all our needs, we may start working towards these greater aims. What I'm going to do is open it out to the audience now. If we can have the lights on. So there'll be 2 mics going around. I'll just remind you of the house rules. 1 question only, maximum 1 minute per question. Make sure it is a question. I'll field 3 questions at a time, and then we'll address them to specific speakers. If there is a speaker you want to address it to, please preface your question with that. If you want to stick your hands up, we'll bring the mics to you. We've got one in the middle here and one on the left.
My name's Paresh. Basically, global warming is a really serious issue that a lot of people don't really have a lot of knowledge about today. I mean, there are a lot of people that say, it's like a hoax, for instance, and I feel that view is very harmful to, a lot of people around the world. So, for a lot of people that might not know what global warming is about, could you just go over, the finer aspects of why it's such a big threat to, countries as a whole, and, maybe explain, how it poses a danger to people around the world?
Okay, yeah. I have the question from the left over there. I want to take one more as well.
So this is a question for all the speakers. We know, and you've kind of touched on it a little bit, I suppose, but just to expand on it, which is, we know that in history, civilizations have collapsed. I'm thinking about the Western Roman Empire, when it collapsed and what happened to Western Europe for 1,000 years. So we certainly know that not only can we slow down, but we can actually regress if we get this badly wrong. And so maybe, 1, your views on that, 2, how likely you think that is, and 3, what institutionally should we be doing in order to prevent that?
Okay, we'll take one more question. One at the back there.
Anyone on the panel address the effect of technology on children, today's children? It can be a powerful tool for them when they're using it correctly, but it can also be very destructive, especially mental health, physical health, not eating. Obesity is one of the things you mentioned. Can you please address that?
Okay, yeah. So we'll start with the global warming question. I think there's 2 aspects. One is this fake news idea that's being perpetrated. As David touched on it, that we may start to regulate it in the future, but certainly in the past 2 years, it's become very evident that fake news has a huge effect on political outcomes. Now, how is that being addressed? And if you could briefly, I think most of our audiences understands global warming, but if you could briefly touch on that.
I don't think most people realise quite how serious global warming could become in a short period of time. Most people sort of imagine a linear projection, well, we're gradually increasing the temperature and it's gradually going to increase again. But there could be positive feedback cycles that in a short period of time we could suddenly increase much more rapidly. That has happened in geological times. There was a time more than 200 million years ago when in a short period of time the global temperature went up about 10 degrees and something like 3/4 of all species on the planet went extinct. It's not entirely sure what caused that, but one of the front-running ideas is that the temperature just reached a certain tipping point, and then greenhouse gases, which were stored deep in tundra or in the seabed, got melted and into the atmosphere, and very quickly it got faster and faster, the speed. I think there are scenarios, we don't know how likely they are, but there are scenarios in which we could have a much faster plunge. We could get the Gulf Stream being knocked out of order or the jet stream being knocked out of order. So I think we need to explain all of that. We need to say it's not certain, but we need to say we need to plan ahead sensibly. Just like if you were told there's a 10% chance that your aeroplane's going to fall out of the sky mid-Atlantic, you won't say, that's okay, I quite fancy my chances 9 out of 10. You won't get on that plane. So we need to have that kind of analysis. But I think the first part of the question was very good too, which is why are people misled by this? And we have to realise there are very powerful forces, at least, to prevent a clear thinking about this. The first one of these is commercial forces. There are many corporations in which it benefits people if they can keep on doing the same as they're already doing. So in the oil companies, Exxon has known for a very long time that there is some effects of global warming, but each generation of managers thinks, well, you know, let the next set of managers sort this out. I want to keep on our current trajectory because I will get my bonus this time round. And so they have much the same way that the tobacco industry confused matters for a long time in terms of the connection between smoking and cancer. They have sought to sow confusion. Even more fundamentally, there is a fear of global control. Many people, especially in America, but we get it in UKIP as well, in Britain, the reason they dislike, and Nigel Lawson is amongst them as well, the former Chancellor, the reason they dislike the theory of global warming is they're afraid. If global warming is true, we're going to need some amount of world government, some amount of world coordination to stop it. And they hate the idea of a world government or world coordination so much that it makes them clutch for all kinds of arguments against. And what we need to show is how there can be a sensible amount of world cooperation, which doesn't require some dictatorship of the United Nations, but a sensible kind of standard-setting body. And we can point to positive examples in the past when the world cooperated to solve the ozone layer, when the world's able to cooperate on things like organising the next Olympics and the next World Cup. You know, we can do that without having a dictatorial world government. We should be able to do the same with carbon pricing. But it's a very deep problem, and we could easily discuss this for 2 hours. What I would like it is let's have this discussion. Let's raise the level of conversation stage by stage so that more people are comfortable to have this discussion without being terrified of it.
Thank you. I think we'll explore that one because you've touched upon a point where a president or a manager that's only going to be there for a limited period of time can leave these things to beyond their tenure. How do you solve that? Is it that our democracy needs to evolve with our technology? I'm going to direct this one at you. Does our reward system, our capitalistic system, need to adjust so that we're rewarding certain types of behavior and certain types of technological advances? How do we directly target problems like global warming, improving education for our children?
Well, I personally have less confidence in the geopolitical organizations like the United Nations and others in order to organize themselves and collective leadership to solve some of these fundamental problems at the pace that I believe, and many do, that need to be solved at. However, when you think about let's call it the democratization of technologies, the access to expertise and knowledge, and when you combine that with consumer power, then I think there's an economic power, which is probably the one language that the vast majority of the planet understands, then perhaps it needs to be flipped around, where a greater collective conscious movement, people power, if you want to call it, an example of Me Too, that really drives the behavior from the grassroots upwards. Clearly, the influencing machinery of the internet and social media and other means of communication are being turned upon ourselves, for sure. My sense is, maybe that's just a deep belief in humanity, that nevertheless that we can differentiate, distinguish between truth or mostly truth and the cause and effect of global warming. Which I think, maybe another way of just simply saying is that actually there's enough body of knowledge and experience and expertise that action could be taken, but actually organised from the ground up. That's probably not answering quite the question. Perhaps you wanted to rephrase it again.
No, that's fine. I think so. Essentially, you have faith in humanity to some extent. Is that fair to say?
I would like to think that, yes.
So let's put that into the context of that question over there. So, on a civilizational timeline, we're talking 1,000 years, possibly shorter, 500. How likely is collapse?
I think, as I said, there's a 30% chance we'll have a terrible collapse in society worldwide by the middle of the century.
30%, a third.
At least a 30% chance.
You agree with
In
that?
fact, if world politics keeps on going badly, as it's been doing in the last few weeks, that probability is going to increase, sadly.
30% you'd agree with?
I would say something. 30% is big. It's high, right? It's enough. It should be enough to make us all sit up and think about this more fundamentally. Well, one of the things that maybe just been watching too much Star Trek, but one of the things that in a way inspires me is that as machine intelligence continues to develop, that should call it that super intelligence, holistic experience that'll exist, that we can access, perhaps will become let's call it a balancing force, such that perhaps that 30% might not happen. In many ways, the runaway process, the positive feedback that you're talking about, I think there are many reasons as to why that could happen, but also that there are, in my view, natural forces now which are going to be out of our control, such as global warming, but also other natural calamities that are going to be out of our control, and therefore external triggers could still, I guess, fulfill that prediction that you're talking about.
Okay, I mean, 30% is fairly high. Put your hands up if you're surprised by 30%. Okay, some pessimists on this side. Okay, fair enough. What would that look like?
Well, let's talk more about machine intelligence, because I think machine intelligence is improving very rapidly. And sadly, just because we get more intelligent doesn't mean to say we are wiser. We can use greater intelligence to pursue our own ulterior motives. We sometimes call ourselves irrational humans, but more accurately, we are a rationalizing human. We are very good at finding excuses for us to keep on doing whatever we want to do already. Vladimir Putin, well-known political philosopher, said recently that the country that leads in artificial intelligence will rule the world. And I think people realize that's true. We might have smarter viruses, smarter malware than ever before. You know, when the North Koreans disliked what Sony Pictures were doing with the film The Interview a few years ago, they unleashed a terrible set of malware that brought Sony Pictures almost to its knees. Now imagine if that malware was driven by an order of magnitude greater intelligence. We could have the whole of the Western society collapsing. If Vladimir Putin feels that his enemies are encroaching on him, just to pick one hypothetical example, he might unleash the next generation of GRU people, not just spreading Novichok, but something worse than Novichok. And it could be driven by artificial intelligence, which unfortunately could have bugs in it. So instead of just having the blue screen of death, I don't know if you've ever seen the blue screen of death on your PC when it crashes, we might have the whole of Western society, the whole of the world society, suffering a blue screen of megadeath, with all our infrastructure collapsing, with poisonous chemicals being unleashed. That's one reason I think there's even higher probability. It's not just a small probability that we could end up in a terrible adverse situation. If we look at why civilizations collapsed in the past, such as the Easter Islanders or the Incas or the people at Angkor Wat in Kampuchea, they were doing things that made some sort of sense for them, but suddenly then they ran out of whatever resources they thought they were needing, and then they were vulnerable to local climate change. So again, it could all happen to us. So to avoid that, we need to talk about these scenarios more fully. The problems that I'm talking about now deserve to be much higher up the set of political agendas. What politicians are spending most of the time worrying about is frankly very small and pathetic compared to what we should be worrying about. And at the same time, we need to be able to point to a very positive vision of a better world. We're going to get to a better world if we have a vision of a better world. If we don't have a vision of a better world, people are going to clutch onto false visions instead, such as Make America Great Again, or let's go back to the 1750s and follow Jacob Rees-Mogg with his view of how Britain should be, you know. Let's have a positive vision, which is the sustainable superabundance, in which the artificial intelligence and the nanotechnology and the synthetic biology is using enhance all of us to higher levels of consciousness, higher levels of well-being.
I think, feel free. I think we'll go to Divya on this and also bring in the last question. So how do we, as an audience, prepare for this, educate the next generation so that they become the generation that develops these answers, that produces these answers?
Just picking up a little bit on what David brilliantly said, I think that there are a few things that we need to be aware of what are the causes that would take things in the right direction. I see jealousy, fear, anger, survival instinct and greed are the things that can drive misuse of the future technology. So how can we minimize the chances of those things being in society, whether it's within our segment of society or on a global scale? So undoubtedly, one of the prime answers is through education. Now, the word education itself is not what we understand it to be. It doesn't mean go to school, stuff yourself full of books and come out. Education comes, of course, from the Latin word educare, meaning to bring out. And there's not enough of self-development and holistic education in the modern education systems on a global scale. It's improving, but there's a lot more emphasis going to be needed on the self-development of children on an individual basis, but bringing that sense of society in them, enable to have that stable intellect, that clarity, that development of wisdom on an inner level, enabling them to be psychologically balanced, because balance at the end of the day is the key, both in use and in terms of individual state of mind and intellect. So if we can concentrate through our education system on bringing out balanced individuals as part of society from the schools, in addition to the book knowledge that they are going to need, that is probably the best thing we can do, because it's very difficult to do that at an adult level. You need to do it at the kids, where they're in the development stage, where they are, you can say in a sense, going to be protected from going on that dark path by having that inner strength and that sense of light inside to naturally do the right thing for everybody. It sounds maybe a little bit far-fetched, but I think that's realistic. That's what I'm doing in the schools that I have in India, where yoga and meditation is the foundation. Meditation is the key, and it's making sharper minds, sharper intellects, overcoming learning disabilities, of course. But it also brings that balance in life and balance of mind and intellect that protects them from feeling jealousy, protects them feeling anger, which are all the things that will actually lead to can lead to misuse of technology.
Thank you very much. That's all we've got time for today. We will just have some closing remarks. So we'll start from this side. Subhash, 5 minutes.
So I think, I guess what I would certainly highlight is that technology, whether it's a help or a hindrance, actually depends not so much about the technology as the hands that wield that tool. The mental stability that you talked about will make a difference. Certainly, I would say that my faith in humanity is still undeterred, and that stabilizing factors will help us to make sure that technology, by and large, is a help. Certainly, I think that the future vision of a flourishing society will look very, very different from one that we're accustomed to today, a largely consumer-driven, wealth-driven society, to one that is elevated in consciousness. The transition from the here to there, I suspect, will be a traumatic one. But on that positive note,
David?
to you.
So, over the last hundreds of years, humans have gained the ability to change nature, and we've wondered about the wisdom of changing nature. In the next few decades, we have the ability to change human nature, and we have to decide to what extent we want to change human nature. And when we look at human nature, we can find many things which are beautiful and wonderful, but we can also find many things that are far from beautiful and wonderful. So we can have very hard decisions to take, shortcuts to things like maybe a shortcut to enlightenment. Maybe there are ways in which we could use smart drugs or music or electric helmets to stimulate people to more quickly bring people to the state of enlightenment. Is that cheating or not? Is that something we should do or not? We need to have that discussion. We can also use technology to help people to live indefinitely long, that we can undo the ravages of aging. Not just that we look younger, but actually the damage which has been accumulating in our bodies can periodically be flushed out with nanobots or genetic engineering or stem cells, whatever. Again, we need to think about these things. We need to see what's possible and we need to weigh them up carefully. We're realizing that in some of these scenarios, there's a lot of future shock. People are disturbed. People say, yuck, this is cheating, this is horrible. But maybe actually when you think a bit more carefully, it is for good. If you compare it to the test tube baby, some of you maybe remember in the 1970s when the possibilities of test tube babies was being discussed, many people said, this is horrible. Imagine what a terrible trauma it's going to be for a child to grow up and learn they're being created in a cold test tube. They'll feel psychologically disturbed. And many people in various religious groups said such a being wouldn't even have a soul. There would be a soulless little devil. And the politicians of the time said, yuck, we shouldn't be bringing more people into the world. We're already suffering from overpopulation. Any doctors who want to do this, they're nasty doctors who are just trying to play God. Stop them. And then when the first few babies, such as Louise Brown in the UK, were born in such a means, people looked at them and said, you know what, they seem to have souls to the same extent as anybody else's souls. And the parents and the family seem to be full of pleasure as a result. Maybe this technology isn't so terrible after all. I think many of the technologies which are on the brink of being deployed and developed, we can indeed use. But to use them wisely, we're going to need a lot of strength. I don't think we can just say it's individuals. I don't even think it's just due to social enterprise. There are some things which are so big that you can't deal with social enterprise. We're going to need political action as well. If some of that was interesting, I'll just briefly mention there's a couple of books which I've written, which you can look up online. I've got a few copies with them. They're on the tables at the front. One of them is called The Abolition of Aging, when I argue that it's not only possible but it's good that we can abolish aging within a few decades. And the other one is How We Need to Fix Politics Before Politics Leads Us Very Badly Astray and Stops Us Enjoying the Full Benefits of Wonderful Technology.
Thank you.
I think I very much enjoyed everybody's concluding remarks, and I would like to bring us back to Dharma, not as an outdated tradition, but a living tradition that is even more important in the modern times where change is accelerating, where a moral compass and simple values in our daily life are even more important. Repeating what I said about Dharma, which is fortitude, forgiveness, control of the mind, non-stealing, cleanliness, purity, control of the senses, wisdom, knowledge, truth, and absence of anger are more important than they perhaps have been in previous generations, and they're certainly most important for going forward to ensure that we rule technology rather than technology ruling us, and that we can use technology for the upliftment of our society rather than the betterment of a precious few.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our panelists. I think beautifully summarised. I think you've emphasised that we really do need to squarely face the reality of what we're facing and discuss it not at an individual, familial, societal level, but all the way through to the top. I'll hand over to Nalaji.
Thank you, Ravi, for chairing tonight's VM. As always, time has caught up with us, and it's time for us to close this event. I hope you found tonight's VM interesting, and ideas such as dharma can help us maximize human flourishing in the light of technology, will help provide all of us with much food for thought. VM fundamentally is about exploration of idea and not giving you solutions. We hope we have given you enough information and insight into taking this into your homes, workplaces, and carrying on the Manthan in your lives. Let me also thank our expert witnesses, Divya, David, and Subhash, and our chair, Ravi. Please join me in a big round of applause.